The forest was deathly silent that December morning, as a heavy blanket of fog crept between the ancient trees of the Ardennes. American soldiers huddled in their foxholes, breath-forming clouds in the frigid air, as they stamped their feet against the biting cold. It was December 16th, 1944, and most believed the war was all but won. Hitler's forces were in retreat, the Allied advance had been steady, and Christmas packages from home were beginning to arrive. None suspected that in mere hours, they would be fighting for their lives in what would become one of the bloodiest battles American forces would face in the European theater. It was quiet, too quiet, recalled Private First Class Vernon Swanson of the 106th Infantry Division. We had been told the Germans were finished, that this was just a quiet sector where we could catch our breath. Then hell opened, up right in front of us. As reported in Voices of the Bulge, The Atlantic, 1994. At 5:30 that morning, more than 200,000 German troops supported by nearly 1,000 tanks launched a massive surprise offensive along an 80-mile front through the densely forested Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. The German plan, personally orchestrated by Hitler himself and codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, was audacious in its objective. Split the Allied forces with a lightning thrust to Antwerp, capture valuable fuel supplies, and potentially force a negotiated peace in the West. For the Americans, it was a perfect storm of vulnerability. Intelligence had failed to detect the massive buildup of German forces. The Ardennes was thinly defended, primarily by inexperienced divisions or battle-weary units sent there to recuperate. The weather had grounded Allied air reconnaissance and support. Communication lines were tenuous, and perhaps most critically, complacency had set in among commanders who believed Germany no longer possessed the capability for a major offensive. General Troy Middleton's White Corps held the center of the American line, a sector so quiet it had earned the nickname the Ghost Front. His forces were stretched dangerously thin, with just 4 divisions covering a front that would normally require at least 8. The newly arrived 106th Infantry Division, having arrived just 5 days earlier, had never seen combat. Veterans of the 2nd and 28th Divisions were recovering from brutal fighting in the Hurtgen Forest. They were sitting ducks. When the German artillery barrage began in the pre-dawn darkness, it came with a ferocity that stunned even hardened veterans. Over 1,000 artillery pieces pounded American positions for nearly an hour before German infantry and armor began pushing forward under cover of the dense fog that neutralized American air superiority. The sky lit up like the 4th of July, remembered Sergeant Frank Curry of the 120th Infantry Regiment. Then came the screaming of the Nebelwerfers, those German rockets we called screaming Mimes. It was the most terrifying sound you could imagine. And when it stopped, here they came through the fog, hundreds of white-clad German infantry, and massive Tiger tanks. As German forces punched through the American front lines, chaos ensued. Units became isolated. Communications broke down. Rumors spread of German commandos in American uniforms infiltrating rear areas. Panic began to take hold as the full scale of the offensive became apparent. By nightfall on that first day, German spearheads had torn gaping holes in the American lines. The 106th Division was virtually surrounded. Elements of the 28th Division were fighting for their lives, and the veteran 4th Infantry Division was desperately trying to prevent a complete collapse of the northern shoulder of what was rapidly becoming a massive bulge in the Allied lines, the protuberance that would give this battle its enduring name. In Washington and London, Allied commanders were stunned by the scope and ferocity of the German offensive. For the American troops on the front lines, the battle was just beginning. They faced not only a determined enemy, but also some of the harshest winter conditions Europe had seen in years. Their resilience would soon be tested as never before. The second day of the German offensive dawned with disaster unfolding for American forces. The gray December sky hung low as German armored columns pushed deeper into Allied territory, creating the distinctive bulge in the American lines that would name the battle. The spearhead of the advance was led by SS Oberstgruppenführer Joseph Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army in the north and General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army in the center. Manteuffel's forces made particularly rapid progress. His tanks advanced nearly 20 miles in just 2 days, a shocking pace given the difficult terrain and winter conditions. The situation was so dire that Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower, meeting with his senior commanders at Verdun on December 18th, summed it up bluntly. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this table. Behind Eisenhower's optimism lay a grim reality. The American forces were in disarray. Entire units had been overrun or surrounded. The 106th Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force, with 2 of its 3 regiments, roughly 7,000 men, surrendering in what would become the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theater since Kasserine Pass. It was like watching a dam break, recalled Lieutenant Colonel Harley Reynolds of 17th Airborne Corps headquarters. Reports kept coming in of units being overrun, of roads clogged with retreating troops and civilians. We knew we were witnessing something momentous and terrible. From Command Decisions in the Bulge, Military Review, 1982. Yet even as some units disintegrated under the German onslaught, others stood their ground with remarkable tenacity. At St. Vith, a critical road junction, Brigadier General Bruce Clark's Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division, alongside elements of the 106th and 28th Infantry Divisions, formed a defensive perimeter that would hold for 6 crucial days despite being nearly surrounded. The most dramatic stand came at the small town of Bastogne, where Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's 101st Airborne Division had been rushed to defend another vital road junction. By December 20th, German forces had completely surrounded the town. When the German commander sent emissaries demanding surrender, McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts," would become legendary in American military lore. The fighting was savage and unrelenting. At Lanzerath Ridge, an 18-man intelligence and reconnaissance platoon from the 99th Infantry Division, led by 20-year-old Lieutenant Lyle Buck, held off a battalion of German paratroopers for an entire day before being overwhelmed. Their stand delayed the advance of the 6th Panzer Army by nearly 24 hours, time that proved invaluable for American forces regrouping to the west. Further north, at the critical Elsenborn Ridge, the veteran 1st Infantry Division, the C, famous Big Red One, alongside elements of the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, formed a defensive line that refused to yield despite repeated German assaults. Their tenacity effectively blocked the northern route to Antwerp and forced the German armor to divert to narrower, more congested routes southward. The human cost was staggering. Villages changed hands multiple times. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. The winter woods became a charnel house where wounded men often froze to death before they could be evacuated. The weather remained the Germans' greatest ally. Dense fog and low clouds continued to ground Allied aircraft, denying the Americans their crucial air superiority. The thick forests channeled movement to the roads, creating bottlenecks where German armor could devastate retreating columns. And the bitter cold, temperatures hovered well below freezing, turned simple survival into a brutal challenge. By December 20th, the German advance had created a bulge nearly 50 miles deep into Allied lines. Yet signs of trouble for the offensive were emerging. German fuel supplies were running critically low, their timetable was slipping, and most ominously, weather forecasters were predicting clearing skies within days, which would unleash the full might of Allied air power against the exposed German columns. For the Americans, reinforcements were rushing toward the battlefield from all directions. The veteran 26th Infantry Division was moving up from the south. The 7th Armored was fighting desperately at St. Vith. And most significantly, General George S. Patton had put his entire Third Army in motion, executing one of the most remarkable pivots in military history, turning 90 degrees from its eastward advance and marching north toward Bastogne. As Christmas approached, the battle hung in the balance. The next few days would determine whether Hitler's gamble would succeed or whether American grit would halt the last great German offensive of the war. The snow fell in thick flakes around the besieged town of Bastogne as Christmas Eve, 1944, approached. Inside the American perimeter, ammunition ran low, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and over 3,000 wounded soldiers filled every available building. The defenders, primarily the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division, had been surrounded for 5 days, holding a critical road junction that German forces desperately needed for their advance. "We were cold, hungry, and outnumbered," remembered Sergeant William McKinley of the 101st Airborne. "But not one man that I knew even considered surrender as a possibility. It just wasn't in our vocabulary." From Rendezvous. With Destiny, the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, Army Heritage Center Foundation Archives. The situation was dire enough that on December 22nd, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe ordered chaplains to hold special prayer services. That same day, however, brought the first break for the defenders. The skies began to clear. Within hours, C-47 transport planes were dropping desperately needed supplies by parachute into the besieged perimeter. Over the next several days, more than 200 tons of ammunition, food, and medical supplies would reach the surrounded troops. The clearing weather brought something even more valuable than supplies: American air power. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs swarmed over the battlefield, attacking German tank columns and supply lines with devastating effect. The Luftwaffe, a shadow of its former self, could offer little resistance to Allied air supremacy. Meanwhile, the German offensive was encountering growing difficulties. Their timetable had slipped dramatically. The stubborn American defense of St. Vith had delayed their northern thrust. Bastogne was proving an impenetrable obstacle in the center. Fuel shortages were becoming critical. Many German tanks were abandoned not because of battle damage, but because they simply ran out of gas. To the south, General George Patton was driving his Third Army northward with characteristic aggression. In a remarkable feat of military flexibility, Patton had pivoted 3 full divisions from their eastward orientation and launched them northward toward Bastogne in just 72 hours. When informed of the German offensive at a command meeting, on December 19th, Patton had immediately declared he could attack within 48 hours. A claim so bold that other generals thought it impossible until they saw it executed. Patton was like a man possessed, recalled Lieutenant General Hoyt Vandenberg. When others saw disaster, he saw opportunity. While the rest of us were still digesting the scale of the German attack, he was already moving his army. By December 26th, the lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne, ending the siege. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding Combat Command B of the 4th Armored, and later to become Army Chief of Staff, led the relief column that finally connected with the 101st Airborne's perimeter. The link-up was emotional for both the rescuers and the rescued. When we saw those Sherman tanks coming up the road, with those beautiful white stars on them, men cried openly, remembered Private First Class Martin Collins of the 101st. Then we got back to business, because the Germans weren't done with us yet. Indeed, the breaking of the siege did not end the battle for Bastogne. German forces launched repeated counterattacks trying to sever the narrow corridor Patton had opened. For another week, bitter fighting raged around the town as the Germans made their final efforts to capture the crucial road junction. Some of the most intense combat occurred at the small village of Foy, just north of Bastogne, where Easy Company, of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, later immortalized in the book and television series Band of Brothers, fought a brutal battle to clear German forces from their positions. The company's commander, Captain Ronald Spears, became legendary for his fearlessness, at one point running straight through German lines to link up with an isolated platoon. By New Year's Eve, however, it was becoming clear that the German offensive had spent its force. The weather had turned against them. Allied air power was relentless. American reinforcements were flooding into the battle zone, and most critically, the Germans had failed to capture the fuel dumps they had targeted, meaning their remaining tanks and vehicles were increasingly immobilized, yet the cost had been terrible. The American defenders of Bastogne had suffered over 2,000 casualties. Across the broader battlefield, tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides had been killed, wounded, or captured. Countless Belgian and Luxembourg civilians had lost their homes or lives in the fighting, and the freezing conditions had claimed hundreds more victims through frostbite and exposure. As 1945 began, the tide of battle had turned, decisively. The Bulge was beginning to flatten as American forces counterattacked from all sides. Hitler's last gamble in the West was failing, but the battle was far from over. The first day of 1945 brought no respite to the snow-covered Ardennes battlefield. Instead, it marked the beginning of a determined Allied counteroffensive to eliminate the bulge that Hitler's forces had punched into their lines. From the north, General Courtney Hodges' First Army pushed southward. From the south, Patton's Third Army continued its relentless drive northward. The German salient, once an arrow pointed at the heart of Allied positions, was becoming a dangerous trap for the Wehrmacht forces within it. "We've got the Germans in a vice now," General Omar Bradley told war correspondents on January 3rd. "And we're going to squeeze until there's nothing left of them in the Ardennes." The Allied counteroffensive faced formidable challenges. The weather remained brutally cold, with temperatures rarely rising above freezing. Snow lay 2 feet deep in many areas. Roads were icy death traps, and German resistance, far from collapsing, remained determined and often fanatical. Near the town of Houffalize, which served as a critical German supply hub, the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, fought with characteristic ruthlessness to hold their positions against the advancing U.S. 2nd Armored Division. The engagement showcased the stark disparity in equipment. The German Tiger and Panther tanks significantly outgunned the American Shermans, forcing U.S. tankers to rely on maneuver, numbers, and air support to overcome their technical disadvantage. "We called them Ronson lighters, our Shermans, because they'd light first time every time when hit," said Sergeant Harold Dorfman of the 2nd Armored Division, referencing a popular cigarette lighter brand. Going against a Tiger was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. You needed 5 Shermans to take out one Tiger, and you'd be lucky if 3 of those Shermans made it. From Armored Combat in the Ardennes, Armor Magazine, 1978. The weather finally broke decisively on January 22nd, allowing Allied air forces to fly thousands of sorties against German positions and supply lines. P-47. Thunderbolts, dubbed Juggernaut by admiring infantry, proved particularly effective against German armor, using their heavy armament and impressive durability to devastating effect. In the air, the Allies faced one last challenge from the Luftwaffe. Operation Bodenplatte, baseplate, launched on January 1st, was a massive German air attack against Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. Nearly 900 German aircraft participated in this last-ditch effort to regain air superiority. While they succeeded in destroying over 200 Allied aircraft on the ground, the Luftwaffe lost irreplaceable pilots in the process, a Pyrrhic victory that effectively ended the German Air Force as a significant threat on the Western Front. 1D. The ground. American infantry continued to bear the brunt of the fighting. The 28th Infantry Division, which had been badly mauled in the initial German assault, was recommitted to battle in the southern sector of the Bulge. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, fighting as regular infantry since their parachutes had been packed away after Market Garden months earlier, pushed forward yard by bloody yard through dense forests and snow-covered fields. The human cost remained staggering. Medics struggled to prevent wounded men from freezing to death before they could be evacuated. Trench foot, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp, cold conditions, disabled thousands of soldiers. Combat fatigue cases spiked as men who had been fighting continuously since the Normandy landings finally reached their breaking point. The civilian population suffered terribly as well. The small towns and villages of the Ardennes changed hands multiple times, leaving homes destroyed and civilians displaced in the bitter winter. Reports of atrocities began to emerge, most notoriously from the town of Malmedy, where SS troops had massacred 84 American prisoners of war during the early days of the offensive. As American forces retook ground, they discovered evidence of similar killings in other locations. By mid-January, the 2 American armies, 1st from the north and 3rd from the south, were drawing closer to each other, threatening to trap significant German forces in the western portion of the Bulge. Hitler, who had micromanaged the offensive from its inception, finally yielded to his general's pleas and authorized a withdrawal on January 8th, but too late to save many of his best remaining formations. On January 16, elements of Patton's Third Army and Hodge's First Army met at Houffalize, effectively cutting the Bulge in half. German units west of this junction were now in danger of complete encirclement. Their withdrawal turned increasingly chaotic, as Allied air power pounded retreating columns and fuel shortages immobilized vehicles that had to be abandoned. The Allied counteroffensive was succeeding, but at a terrible price. In gaining back ground that had been safely in American hands just a month earlier, thousands more soldiers had fallen. The strategic initiative had been preserved, but the human cost would echo through American cities and towns for generations to come. As January 1945 progressed, and American forces continued to push the Wehrmacht back toward the Thai German border, the full human dimension of the Battle of the Bulge began to emerge. The snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, once pristine winter landscapes, were now littered with the detritus of modern warfare. Burnt-out tanks and vehicles, shell casings by the thousands, abandoned equipment, and most sobering of all, the thaw. Frozen bodies of fallen soldiers from both sides. Medical units worked around the clock processing the wounded and the dead. Field hospitals, set up in whatever buildings remained standing, overflowed with casualties. The 83rd General Hospital near Liège treated more than 6,000 patients in January alone, many suffering from severe frostbite as well as combat wounds. We ran out of morphine, then plasma, then bandages, recalled Captain Eleanor York, an Army nurse. But we never ran out of patients. They kept coming, hour after hour, day after day. Young boys with missing limbs, terrible. Burns, wounds that I can't even describe. And the cold made everything worse. So many arrived already showing signs of gangrene because they'd been lying in the snow for hours before medics could reach them. From Angels of the Battlefield, Nurses of the Bulge, American Journal of Nursing, 1969. The battle produced psychological casualties as well. Combat exhaustion, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, affected thousands of soldiers who had endured the terrifying German onslaught, followed by weeks of bitter fighting in brutal winter conditions. Many were veterans who had been in combat continuously since North Africa or Sicily. Their reserves of courage and endurance finally depleted. For American replacements who had arrived just before or even during the battle, the experience was particularly traumatic. Often sent to the front with minimal training and no combat experience, these young men found themselves thrust into one of the most intense battles of the war. Their casualty rates were disproportionately high, a fact that would prompt soul-searching among military leadership about replacement policies. The civilian population of the Ardennes paid a heavy price as well. Thousands of Belgian and Luxembourg citizens found themselves homeless in the depth of winter, their villages destroyed by the fighting. Others had been killed in the crossfire, or in some cases, executed by SS troops. The ancient town of St. Vith was almost completely destroyed. Houffalize was left in ruins. Bastogne, despite its successful defense, suffered severe damage from German artillery and bombing. We returned to find nothing, said Marcel Dubois, a Belgian farmer whose family had fled their home near Malmedy. Our house, our barn, our animals, all gone. Just stones and ashes remained, and we were the lucky ones. We survived. From Ardennes Civilians, the Forgotten Victims, Belgian Historical Review, 1991. As January drew to a close and the last German forces were pushed back to their start lines, the accounting began. American casualties totaled more than 75,000 men killed, wounded, captured, or missing, making the Battle of the Bulge the costliest single battle ever fought by the United States Army. More than 19,000 Americans had been killed. The British forces, though involved on a smaller scale, suffered around 1,000 casualties. German losses were even higher. Estimates range from 80,000 to more than 100,000 casualties. Perhaps more significantly, the IC Germans had committed their last strategic reserves to the offensive. The elite panzer divisions, the experienced infantry formations, the precious fuel stocks, all had been expended in Hitler's final gamble in the West. They could not be replaced. Beyond the raw numbers lay countless personal tragedies. The 106th Infantry Division, which had arrived at the front just 5 days before the German attack, lost more than 7,000 men, most taken prisoner when 2 of its regiments were surrounded. Many of these prisoners were marched deep into Germany in brutal conditions that echoed the infamous Bataan Death March in the Pacific Theater. The 99th Infantry Division, another unit hit hard in the initial assault, lost nearly a quarter of its strength. The 28th Division suffered similarly heavy casualties. Even elite units like the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions rushed to the battlefield to stem the German tide, saw their ranks severely depleted. Individual acts of heroism abounded amid the carnage. Private First Class Francis S. Curry, with just a bazooka and machine gun, destroyed several German tanks and rescued 5 trapped American soldiers, actions for which he would receive the WWII Medal of Honor. Staff Sergeant Archer T. Gammon charged a Tiger tank with only his rifle and grenades, sacrificing his life, but saving his platoon, another posthumous Medal of Honor recipient. In total, 17 Medals of Honor would be awarded for actions during the Battle of the Bulge, testimony to the extraordinary courage displayed by American soldiers in those desperate weeks. By the end of January, most American units had been withdrawn from the line for rest and replenishment. Fresh divisions moved up to continue the advance into Germany. For the survivors of the Bulge, however, the battle would never truly end. They carried its memories and, often its physical and psychological scars, for the rest of their lives. By early February 1945, the last vestiges of the Bulge had been eliminated. American forces now stood roughly where they had been on December 15th, but the armies on both sides had been irrevocably transformed by the 6 weeks of brutal combat in the snow-covered Ardennes. For the Germans, the Battle of the Bulge represented the last throw of the dice, Hitler's final attempt to change the course of a war that was already strategically lost. The failure of the offensive sealed Germany's fate. The Western Allies could now advance toward the Rhine with renewed confidence, while in the east, the Soviet juggernaut had launched its massive winter offensive that would carry the Red Army to the Oder River, just 40 miles from Berlin. "The Ardennes was our death knell," wrote General Alfred Jodl in his prison diary after the war. "We committed our last reserves of men, machines, and material to that offensive. When it failed, we had nothing left with which to resist the Allied onslaught that followed." From The View from OKW, International Military Studies Journal, 1953. For American forces, the battle provided harsh but valuable lessons. Intelligence failures had allowed the German buildup to go undetected, leading to reforms in how information was gathered and analyzed. The vulnerability of replacement troops had exposed flaws in the training system, and tactically, the superiority of German tanks had once again been demonstrated, accelerating the deployment of more capable American tanks like the M26 Pershing. More profoundly, the battle had proven the fundamental resilience and fighting spirit of American soldiers. Thrown into crisis, facing overwhelming odds in terrible conditions, units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne and the 2nd Infantry Division at Elsenborn Ridge had not just survived, but prevailed. The American soldier has been underestimated by our enemies and sometimes by our allies, General Eisenhower told reporters in February. What he accomplished in the Ardennes should put those underestimations to rest forever. Indeed, the Battle of the Bulge quickly entered American military lore as a defining moment, a trial by fire that had tested and proven the nation's fighting forces. Veterans of the battle would carry a special pride in having weathered Hitler's last desperate gamble and emerged victorious. For the civilian population of the Ardennes, recovery took years. Villages had to be rebuilt, fields cleared of unexploded ordnance, and the dead, military and civilian, given proper burial. The landscape itself bore the scars of battle, with forests shredded by artillery and tank tracks gouged into farmland. The strategic impact of the battle extended far beyond the Ardennes. By committing his last reserves to the Western Front, Hitler had weakened German defenses in the east, accelerating the Soviet advance and likely shortening the war by weeks or months. The offensive also consolidated the Western Alliance, silencing voices that had advocated negotiating with Germany and cementing the determination to accept nothing short of unconditional surrender. In the decades that followed, the Battle of the Bulge would be remembered and commemorated in countless ways. Hollywood films like Battleground, 1949, and Battle of the Bulge, 1965, brought the story to mass audiences. Memorials were erected throughout the Ardennes, from the imposing American memorial at Bastogne to small markers in villages that had seen the heaviest fighting. Veterans returned to the battlefield in increasing numbers as the decades passed, first as young men in their 30s, then as middle-aged family men, and finally as elderly witnesses to history, often accompanied by grandchildren or great-grandchildren. Their pilgrimages became a way of honoring fallen comrades and processing experiences that many had rarely discussed at home. "I didn't talk about the war for 40 years, said Technical Sergeant Ernest Pusey of the 26th Infantry Division, visiting Bastogne on the 50th anniversary of the battle. But coming back here, seeing where we fought and bled, it helps make peace with those memories. And it's important that younger generations know what happened here, what their grandfathers and great-grandfathers did to preserve freedom." From Returning to the Ardennes, Veterans Affairs Quarterly, 1994. For military historians and strategists, the Battle of the Bulge continues to offer valuable lessons. It demonstrates the dangers of underestimating an enemy's capabilities and intentions. It illustrates the critical importance of flexibility and resilience in military operations. And perhaps most significantly, it shows how leadership at all levels, from Eisenhower's strategic calm to the tactical initiative of sergeants leading small units in isolated firefights, shapes the outcome of battles. Today, the forests of the Ardennes have regrown. The villages have been rebuilt. But beneath the peaceful surface, the earth still holds remnants of that terrible winter. Shell fragments, rusted equipment, and occasionally the remains of soldiers still listed as missing in action. Each year, farmers plowing their fields unearth these artifacts, a continuing reminder of the battle that flared with such intensity 75 years ago. The true legacy of the Battle of the Bulge, however, lives not in the soil of Belgium and Luxembourg, but in the collective memory of the nations involved. For Americans especially, it stands as testimony to the generation that faced humanity's darkest hour with courage, determination, and ultimately, triumph. In the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, American grit was indeed tested and not found wanting.